The rain was the first thing you forgot and the last thing you remembered. Here on Leyte, in the dying months of 1944, it wasn't just water falling from the sky. It was a state of being. It fell in sheets that blurred the world into a smear of green and brown, a relentless, hissing curtain that separated you from everything sane and dry. When it wasn't falling, the memory of it lived in the air, a thick, soupy humidity that clung to your skin like a second, sweat-soaked uniform. The ground never dried. It just festered, turning into a greedy, shoe-sucking morass of mud the color of rust and old blood. This island, this godforsaken slice of hell General MacArthur was so keen on taking back, was trying to drown us from the sky and swallow us from the ground. My name is Sergeant Frank Miller. My men, what's left of them, call me Breaker, and I've earned that name on hotter, sandier battlefields than this. I earned it in the dust of Kasserine and the stony hills of Sicily. But the Pacific was a different kind of war. It wasn't a war of sweeping tank battles and clear lines on a map. It was a war of inches, fought in a jungle so dense it could choke the sound of a rifle shot 100 feet away. It was a personal, rotten war fought against an enemy who seemed to be born from the mud itself, and against the jungle, which was an enemy all on its own. My platoon, 3rd Platoon, Baker Company, was a ghost of its former self. We'd landed on the beach a few weeks back, full of piss and vinegar, and the island had bled us white. We now held a miserable ridge line overlooking a trail that was little more than a pig track. Our world was a collection of waterlogged foxholes connected by slick trenches. We'd been here for 6 days, waiting for relief, waiting for orders, waiting for a dry pair of socks that were never going to come. The only thing that came reliably was the rain and the Japs. The men were quiet. The loud ones were either dead or had learned the hard way that noise gets you killed in the jungle. Corporal Deacon Miller, no relation, was cleaning his bar with a religious fervor, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He was a good man, steady as a rock, but the light in his eyes had dimmed. Private First Class Sal Brooklyn Vitelli was trying to coax a wet cigarette to life under his poncho, cursing in a low, guttural whisper. He was the squad's mouth, but even he was running out of things to say. Then there was Doc Russo, our medic, whose hands, stained with plasma and sulfa powder, never seemed to stop trembling. We were all worn down to the bone, our uniforms rotting on our backs, our faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. Any word on those replacements, Sarge? Brooklyn's voice was raspy, cutting through the hiss of the rain. I shifted my weight, the wet canvas of my pack digging into my shoulders. They'll get here when they get here. And when they do, they'll be just as green and useless as the last batch. It was the truth. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, was sending us boys who looked like they should be at a high school dance, not fighting phantoms in a jungle that wanted to eat them alive. They came with clean uniforms and wide eyes, and they died before we could even learn their names. They were walking ghosts, liabilities in a place where one mistake, one careless cough, one moment of hesitation could get your whole squad wiped out. I didn't hate them for it. I hated the machine that sent them to me. My job was to keep the men I had left alive, and these new kids, these lambs for the slaughter, they were a threat to that. They were like a disease, the sickness of inexperience, and I was the surgeon who had to cut it out before it spread. Sometimes that meant being hard. Sometimes it meant being cruel. Cruelty was a tool, same as a trench knife or a grenade. A dead kid couldn't learn. A scared kid might. The sound of the supply jeep churning its way up the muddy track from the rear was the only warning we got. It slid to a halt, its engine whining, and a fresh-faced lieutenant, a kid named Harris who still thought this was all a grand adventure, hopped out. "Miller," he shouted, his voice too loud, too cheerful. "Got your new blood. Fresh off the boat." I didn't get up. I just watched from under the dripping rim of my helmet as 3 figures emerged from the back of the jeep. 3 new chances to die. 2 of them were what I expected, nervous farm boys from somewhere in the Midwest, their faces pale with a mixture of seasickness and fear. They clutched their M1s like they were holy relics, their knuckles white. But the third one was different. He stepped down from the jeep, not with a clumsy thud, but with a certain careful grace, as if he was trying to avoid soiling his brand-new boots. His uniform wasn't just new. It was immaculate, the olive drab fabric still stiff, the creases sharp. He was tall and slender, with a clean-shaven jaw and hair that looked like it had been styled by a barber just that morning. He carried his rifle, but he didn't clutch it. He held it as if it were an accessory, something that completed his outfit. He looked around at the dripping jungle, the muddy men, the miserable squalor of our position, and his expression was one of mild distaste, like he'd just walked into a dirty restroom. Lieutenant Harris slapped him on the back. "This here is Private Charles Pennington, Jr., all the way from Boston. Says he's ready to give Tojo what for." Charles Pennington, Jr. The name itself was an insult. It sounded like money, like privilege, like everything we weren't. I finally pushed myself up, the mud sucking at my boots, and walked over. I circled him like a predator inspecting a potential meal. The other men watched, their faces impassive. They knew what was coming. It was a ritual. "Pennington," I said, my voice low and flat. I let the name hang in the air, tasting the absurdity of it. "You have any idea where you are, Junior?" He stood a little straighter, if that was even possible. "Yes, Sergeant. The Philippines. Island of Leyte." He spoke with a crisp, educated accent that was as out of place here as a tuxedo. "Wrong." I grunted, getting closer, invading his personal space. I could smell the soap on his skin. Soap. We hadn't seen a bar of soap in weeks. "You're in hell. And in hell, we don't have last names like Pennington. We don't have juniors. You're a body. A warm body to stop a bullet that might have been meant for a better man. You got that?" He swallowed, but his eyes met mine. There wasn't fear in them, not the raw, animal panic I was used to seeing. There was something else. Annoyance? Confusion? "I understand, Sergeant." "No, you don't." I jabbed a finger at his chest. His clean, crisp chest. "You think this is a game? A scouting trip? Let me see your rifle." He handed it to me. It was a standard M1 Garand, but it felt wrong in my hands. It was too clean. The stock was polished, the metal gleaming. He hadn't even worked the action enough to wear the Parkerized finish. I popped the clip out. A full clip, 8 rounds, ready to go. I sniffed the chamber. Oil. Clean gun oil. Not the smell of burnt powder and desperation that clung to ours. "Ever fire this thing at a man, Pennington?" "No, Sergeant. Only at targets." "Well, the targets here shoot back," I snarled, handing it back to him. "And they don't stand still for you. They hide in the trees, in the mud. They'll cut your throat while you're sleeping, and you'll never even hear them coming." My eyes drifted down to his wrist, and that's when I saw it. It was a watch, but it wasn't a standard-issue Army timepiece. It was gold, or at least gold-plated, with a thin leather strap and a delicate, shimmering face. It was the kind of watch a man wore to a country club, not to a war. It was so utterly, profoundly out of place that for a moment, I was speechless. It was a shining beacon of his wealth, his softness, his complete disconnect from the reality of our existence. Brooklyn let out a low whistle. "Check out the hardware on the new guy." "What's that, Pennington? Did your daddy give you that so you wouldn't be late for the war?" A faint blush crept up Pennington's neck. "It was a graduation present, Corporal." "Corporal," Brooklyn mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "Ooh la dita. He's a regular gentleman." I held up a hand, silencing him. My eyes were still locked on the watch. "Take it off." Pennington looked at me, confused. "Sergeant." I said, "Take it off. Now." My voice was dangerously quiet. "You think the Japs are blind? A sniper will see the flash from that thing a mile away. He'll put a bullet right between your eyes before you can even tell him the time. You want to die for a piece of jewelry?" He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers suddenly clumsy. He slipped the watch off and held it in his palm. It looked small and fragile. A useless, expensive trinket. "Put it in your pack," I ordered. "And if I ever see it on your wrist again, I'll personally wrap it around your throat. Your gear is for keeping you alive. Nothing else. If it doesn't shoot, or stop a bullet, or hold water, or feed you, you don't need it. Is that clear?" "Yes, Sergeant. Crystal clear." He tucked it away, his movements stiff. "Good." I turned to Deacon. "He's with you. Find him a hole to sleep in. Try to teach him how not to get himself killed before breakfast." Deacon just nodded, his face unreadable, and led the new kid away. I watched him go, this boy named Charles Pennington, Jr. He walked carefully, picking his way through the mud, his back ramrod straight. He was a perfect specimen of everything I despised. He was soft, privileged, and naive. He was a liability. And in my gut, I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had seen too many boys die, that he was going to be a burden. I just didn't know how heavy that burden would be. The next few days were a masterclass in incompetence. We didn't call him Pennington. Brooklyn had christened him Shiny on that first day, and the name stuck like mud. It was for the watch, for the clean uniform, for the naive shine in his eyes that hadn't been scoured out by horror yet. Everything he did, or failed to do, only reinforced the name. His first assignment was to dig a proper foxhole. Deacon showed him where, on a slope with a decent field of fire, and how to dig a sump at the bottom to collect the rainwater. An hour later, I came by to check on him. He was barely a foot down, sweating buckets, his face smeared with mud for the first time. His movements were awkward, inefficient. He was scooping dirt like a child playing in a sandbox. "What in God's name is that?" I asked, my voice flat. He looked up, breathing heavily. "I'm digging, Sergeant." "You're making a mess, is what you're doing. You think a Japanese mortar shell is going to care that you're tired? That hole needs to be deep enough to cover your whole body, and then some. And where's your sump? First time it rains hard, you'll be sleeping in a bathtub. You want to get trench foot on your first week?" He just stared at me, his eyes wide. He had no idea. He'd probably had gardeners his whole life. The closest he'd ever come to digging a hole was for a croquet wicket on his father's lawn. I grabbed the entrenching tool from his hands and drove it into the earth with a series of quick, violent stabs. "Like this," I grunted, scooping out a large chunk of clay and flinging it to the side to build up the parapet. "Use your body weight. Conserve your energy. Every move has a purpose. You're not digging for fun, you're digging for your life." I worked for a minute straight, the muscles in my back and shoulders screaming in protest, showing him the rhythm of it. Then I threw the tool back at his feet. "Now do it right." He did, or at least he tried. But he was clumsy, soft. His hands, which had probably never known a callus, were raw and bleeding by the time the hole was barely adequate. He never complained, not a single word, but his silence was somehow more irritating than any whining would have been. It was the stoicism of the privileged, the quiet endurance of someone who assumed that discomfort was a temporary and solvable problem, like a poorly cooked steak at a restaurant. Then there was the food. K-rations were a miserable fact of life. A wax-coated box of biscuits that could break a tooth, a tin of processed meat, a packet of instant coffee, and 4 cigarettes. It was fuel, nothing more. You ate it cold, in the rain, and you were grateful for it. On his second night, I saw Shiny sitting by his foxhole, staring at his ration box with a look of utter bewilderment. He was trying to read the ingredients on the tin of pork and egg yolk. "It says here this is edible," he muttered to himself, poking at the congealed, yellow-gray mass with his bayonet. Brooklyn, who could hear a whisper from 50 yards, sauntered over. "What's the matter, Shiny? Your caviar not up to snuff?" "It's just the texture," Shiny said, his nose wrinkled in disgust. "And the smell." "Yeah, well, the smell of your own guts rotting in this mud is a whole lot worse," Brooklyn shot back, grabbing the tin from him. He scooped out a large glob with his finger and ate it in one bite. Delicious. Better than my ma's, I tell ya." He grinned, a smear of yellow grease on his chin. "You gonna eat that, or you want to write a letter to the chef and complain?" Shiny shook his head and took the tin back, forcing himself to take a small, hesitant bite. He gagged, but he swallowed it. From that point on, he ate his rations without a word, but he did it with the grim determination of a man taking medicine. He was a tourist in our misery, and it was clear he found the local cuisine lacking. But the worst part was the noise. The jungle at night was a symphony of the damned. Insects buzzed and clicked in 1,000 different rhythms. Strange birds called out with mournful cries, and things you couldn't see rustled in the undergrowth just beyond the perimeter. To a veteran, it was just background noise. You learned to filter it, to listen for the one sound that didn't belong. The snap of a twig under a boot, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the faint whisper of Japanese. Shiny couldn't filter anything. Every falling leaf, every chittering monkey, was an enemy patrol to him. On his third night, he was on watch in his foxhole with Deacon. I was trying to get a few minutes of shut-eye when I was jolted awake by a frantic whisper. "Deacon, Deacon, I hear something. Over there, by the big tree." I was up in an instant, my heart pounding, my Thompson in my hands. The whole squad was stirring, weapons at the ready. We sat in the darkness, listening, our senses strained. We heard nothing but the usual nocturnal orchestra. Where? I hissed into the dark. To the left flank. Shiny's voice was a high-pitched, panicked whisper. I swear, I heard them talking. We waited. The seconds stretched into minutes. The rain started again, a soft patter on the leaves. Still nothing. Finally, a guttural croak echoed from the direction Shiny had indicated. Brooklyn started to laugh, a low, choked sound. Talking, huh? Sarge, I think Shiny's found himself a frog. The tension broke. The men slumped back into their holes, muttering curses. I crawled over to Shiny's position, my anger a cold knot in my stomach. Deacon just looked at me and shook his head wearily. Private, I whispered, my voice like ice. You ever do that again, and I will personally tie a gag in your mouth. You don't make a sound, you don't even breathe, unless you are 100% certain you see a Jap. Not hear one, not think you hear one. See one. You just put half this platoon on edge because of a goddamn amphibian. You got everyone's adrenaline pumping for nothing. Now they won't be able to sleep, and tomorrow they'll be tired. And tired men make mistakes. Tired men die. Your fear is going to get someone killed. Do you want that on your conscience? He was trembling, whether from fear or the cold, I couldn't tell. No, Sergeant. Then learn the difference between a bullfrog and a battalion of the Imperial Army. I snarled and crawled back to my hole, my anger burning off the last chance of sleep. He wasn't just soft. He was a hazard. Our first move to a new position confirmed it. It was only a 2-mile hump to a neighboring ridge, but it might as well have been a marathon. The trail was a river of mud, and the jungle pressed in on all sides, its vines and thorns grabbing at our gear. Shiny was a walking disaster. His perfectly packed gear, which had looked so impressive on the beach, was a liability here. His canteen sloshed. His bayonet clanked against his entrenching tool. He made more noise than a Sherman tank. And he struggled with the mud. He slipped and slid, his new boots finding no purchase. Within the first 100 yards, he was covered head to toe in the stuff. And he hated it. I could see it in the way he constantly tried to wipe his hands on his trousers, the way he flinched when mud spattered on his face. At one point, he stumbled and fell flat on his face, his rifle sinking into a deep puddle. He came up sputtering, his clean Boston accent spitting mud. This filth, he gasped. It's everywhere. I'd had enough. I grabbed him by the front of his pack harness and hauled him to his feet, my face inches from his. Listen to me, you rich little bastard. I hissed, my voice shaking with a rage I could barely control. This is not filth. This is the ground. This is the whole damn world. You are not going to find a clean spot. You are not going to be dry again until you are on a boat home or in a grave. The sooner you accept that, the better your chances of seeing that boat. Now pick up your rifle, shut your mouth, and keep moving. He stared at me, his eyes shocked. But he did it. He picked up his mud-caked Garand and stumbled on, his humiliation a palpable thing. The men didn't even laugh. It wasn't funny anymore. He was our problem, our burden. The breaking point came a week after his arrival. We were on patrol, a routine sweep of the sector. The jungle was quieter than usual, that dead, heavy silence that always set my teeth on edge. I had Shiny near the front of the column, right behind my point man, where I could keep an eye on him. We were crossing a small clearing when it happened. The single, sharp crack of an Arisaka rifle. My point man, a kid from Ohio named Miller, no relation to me or Deacon, just a cosmic joke, grunted and went down, a neat, dark hole appearing in his helmet. The rest of us hit the dirt instantly, the motion as automatic as breathing. All of us, except Shiny. He just stood there, in the middle of the clearing. His rifle was half raised, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He was frozen solid, a perfect statue for the sniper to work on. Get down, I screamed, the words tearing from my throat. He didn't move. His eyes were locked on the spot where our point man had fallen. He was gone. The fear had consumed him. There was no time to think. I did the only thing I could. I lunged from my position, covering the 10 feet between us in 2 desperate bounds. I hit him low and hard, a tackle that would have made a football coach proud. We crashed to the ground together, landing in a heap behind the meager cover of a fallen log. A split second later, a second shot zipped through the air where his chest had been, smacking into a tree with a vicious thud. I rolled off him, my lungs burning, my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with a dawning horror of what had just almost happened. I didn't help him up. I didn't say a word of comfort. I grabbed a fistful of his muddy uniform and pulled his face close to mine. My voice was a low, venomous whisper. You froze, I said, each word a chip of ice. You stood there like a goddamn scarecrow waiting for the crows. I just risked my life for yours. My life. And the lives of every man in this squad who depends on me. For what? For a coward who can't even remember to fall down when he's being shot at. I let him go, shoving him back into the mud. The sniper was gone, spooked by our return fire. But Miller was still dead. A good man gone. And Shiny had stood there and watched. We carried Miller's body back to the ridge. The men wouldn't look at Shiny. They gave him a wide berth, as if his fear were contagious. He was an outcast, isolated not just by his background, but by a failure so profound it had almost cost 2 lives. That night, as I sat in my foxhole, the rain washing the jungle clean, I knew something had to be done. He wasn't just a burden anymore. He was a threat. He was a walking ghost, and I was afraid of the company he was going to take with him when he finally got put in the ground. I was responsible for the lives of my men, and Charles Pennington Jr. was a risk I could no longer afford. He was a problem that needed solving, and in the unforgiving mathematics of war, there was only one way to solve a problem like that. The death of a man in combat is a strange thing. It's not like in the movies. There's no swell of music, no dramatic last words. There is a sudden, violent noise, and then a silence that is louder than the noise ever was. A space opens up where a man used to be. A voice that was just complaining about the sea rations is gone. A bunk that was always occupied is empty. In the days that followed the sniper incident, the silence where Private Miller used to be was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the platoon. The men felt it. They walked a little quieter, their eyes a little darker. Grief, in a place like this, was a luxury we couldn't afford. It curdled into something else, something harder and more useful: anger. And all of it was directed at the one person who stood in the clearing while a good man died. Private Charles Pennington Jr. became a ghost. He still wore the uniform, carried the rifle, and drew his rations, but he was no longer a part of the squad. He was an appendix, a useless organ that threatened to poison the rest of the body. The men perfected the art of looking through him. When he tried to speak, they would suddenly find something fascinating about the mud on their boots. When he sat down to eat, a space would magically clear around him, an invisible wall of contempt. Brooklyn, who could normally make a joke out of a mortar attack, was silent and cold. Deacon, the moral compass of our little group, would simply turn his back and clean his bar, his message clearer than any shouted insult. I encouraged it. I let their silent shunning do its work. It was a form of discipline, a lesson hammered home without a single punch being thrown. You are part of a whole. Your weakness is everyone's weakness. Your fear is a disease that can infect us all. He had failed the most fundamental test of a combat soldier. He had put himself before the squad. In that frozen moment in the clearing, he had thought only of his own terror, and a man had paid the price for it. In my mind, the equation was simple. Pennington's fear had killed Miller as surely as the sniper's bullet. I watched him during those days, this boy with the fancy name and the haunted eyes. He was trying. I had to give him that. He dug his foxhole without being told. He ate his food without a grimace. He stayed quiet on watch. He was trying to follow the rules, to become the soldier I had screamed at him to be. But it was too late. He was like a man trying to mend a shattered vase with glue. The pieces might hold for a while, but the cracks were always there. The trust was broken, not just between him and the men, but inside himself. He moved with a permanent flinch, his eyes constantly darting into the jungle, seeing ghosts in every shadow. The sniper had missed his heart, but had shot his nerve to pieces. My own anger had cooled from a hot rage into something colder and heavier. It settled in my gut like a block of ice. Every time I looked at Pennington, I saw Miller's face. I saw the hole in his helmet. I saw a dozen other faces, too. Boys I had trained, boys I had led, boys I had watched die on beaches and in fields and in dusty streets from here to North Africa. My job was to make the hard decisions that kept the rest of them breathing. My job was triage. And as I watched Pennington fumble with his canteen, his hands shaking so badly he spilled half the precious water, I made a decision. He was a casualty who just hadn't fallen down yet. I couldn't fix him. I couldn't trust him. But I could contain him. I could isolate the disease before it wiped out the platoon. I was just waiting for the opportunity. It came 4 days after Miller's death, in the form of Lieutenant Harris, who sloshed his way up to our ridge with a map case tucked under his arm and a look of boyish excitement on his face that made me want to spit. He found me reinforcing a machine gun nest with sandbags. "Miller, good news," he chirped. "Command's finally ready to move on that supply depot in the Carigara Valley. High-altitude recon shows minimal activity. Looks like the Japs pulled out in a hurry. Should be a walk in the park. We're to go in, assess what they left behind, and mark any munitions for the engineers to blow." He unrolled his map on a crate, a pristine sheet of paper that was an insult to the muddy reality it represented. He pointed a clean finger at a spot marked with a small red circle, deep in a valley a few miles from our current position. "Here it is. Intel says it was a major hub for the Japanese 35th Army. They were routed south of us last week. The place should be a ghost town. Maybe a few stragglers, but nothing a platoon can't handle." I stared at the map, my eyes tracing the contour lines, the dense green patches that marked impassable jungle, the thin blue line of a river that would be a swollen, brown torrent in this rain. A walk in the park. A ghost town. I had heard those words before. They were the words officers used right before a lot of good men died. The Japanese didn't just abandon major supply hubs. They fortified them. They booby-trapped them. They left behind dedicated, suicidal rear guards who would fight until the last man, taking as many of us with them as they could. To them, a retreat was just an opportunity to set a more complex ambush. "With all due respect, Lieutenant," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "Intel has been wrong before. High-altitude recon can't see a machine gun nest tucked under a triple canopy jungle." Harris's smile tightened. He was a West Point boy, full of theory and confidence, and he didn't like being questioned by a grizzled old sergeant. "I trust the intelligence, Sergeant. Our orders are to move out at 0500 tomorrow. Your platoon will take the lead. You'll follow this trail here." He traced a path on the map and establish a perimeter around the depot. "We want a full report by nightfall." I looked at the trail he was pointing to. It was the most direct route, running straight down the gut of the valley. It was a perfect channel for an ambush, a killing floor with high ground on both sides. It was a suicide march. "Sir, that trail is a bottleneck. We'd be exposed the whole way. If we swing wide, to the west, we can approach from the high ground. It's a longer route, but it's safer. We'd be coming down on them, not walking up to their front door." "The orders specify the direct route, Miller," he said, his tone sharp. "We need to be fast. The rest of the company is moving up behind us. We can't afford a scenic tour of the island." He rolled up the map, the conversation officially over. "Have your men ready. 0500. He splashed his way back toward the rear, leaving me with the orders that were going to get us killed. I stood there in the rain, the cold knot in my stomach tightening. Harris wasn't a bad man, just a dangerously inexperienced one. He saw a line on a map. I saw a trail of dead bodies. I had to follow the order, but I didn't have to follow it stupidly. And as I thought about the risk, about the men I had left, my eyes drifted across our miserable camp to the solitary figure of Private Pennington, clumsily trying to patch a hole in his poncho, a picture of pathetic isolation. The opportunity one had been waiting for had just arrived. I called the squad leaders together an hour later, huddled under a large, makeshift tarp that did a poor job of keeping the rain off. Deacon, Brooklyn, and a corporal named Sanchez. I laid out the mission just as the lieutenant had given it to me, my voice devoid of emotion. I watched their faces as I spoke. They were veterans. They didn't need to see the map to know what a trail in a valley meant. I saw the slight tightening of Brooklyn's jaw, the way Deacon's eyes seemed to retreat further into his skull. "It's a bad one, Sarge," Sanchez said quietly when I finished. He was a small, wiry man from Texas who had a sixth sense for trouble. "Every day is a bad one, Sanchez," I replied. "This is just tomorrow's." I paused, letting the weight of the order settle on them. Then I played my card. "The plan is to move fast and hard down that trail. But we'll be blind. The real danger is what's waiting for us on the ridges overlooking the valley. That's where they'll have their machine guns, their mortars. We need eyes up there. Eyes that can warn us before we walk into the meat grinder." I looked over at Pennington, who was sitting alone 20 yards away, trying to clean his rifle, his movements still slow and uncertain. He was pointedly not looking in our direction, but I knew he could hear me. "Pennington," I called out. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise at being addressed directly. "Get over here." He scrambled to his feet and hurried over, stopping a few feet away, as if afraid to get too close. He looked like a stray dog, hoping for a scrap, but expecting a kick. I pointed on my own worn map to a ridge on the eastern side of the valley, directly opposite the trail we were supposed to take. It was a steep, jungle-choked monster of a hill, labeled on the map as Ridge 212. "You see this ridge, Private?" "Yes, Sergeant." "That ridge provides a perfect overwatch position for the entire valley. From up there, you can see our entire approach route and the depot itself. I need a man up there. A spotter. It's the most important job of this whole operation. If there's a trap, our man on that ridge will see it before we do." I let my gaze sweep over the tired faces of Deacon, Brooklyn, and Sanchez. I looked at their worn gear, their hollow eyes. Then I locked my eyes on Pennington. I can't spare one of my veterans. I need every rifle I've got on the main assault. "You're going to be our eyes, Pennington." The effect was instantaneous. A flicker of something, hope, maybe even gratitude, flashed across his face. He was being given a chance, a mission, a way back in. He didn't see the truth of it. He didn't see that Ridge 212 was a remote, isolated piece of rock, miles away from the real action. He didn't understand that I was sending him on a fool's errand, a wild goose chase to get him out from under my feet. The other men understood immediately. I saw the flicker of comprehension in their eyes. Brooklyn's expression was a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like pity. Deacon's face was a stone mask, but he subtly shook his head, a gesture so small that only I could see it. He knew what I was doing. He didn't approve, but he wouldn't challenge me in front of the others. "Me, Sergeant." Pennington's voice was barely a whisper. "You," I said, my voice hard. "You'll take a field phone, a full spool of wire, 2 days of extra rations, and all the water you can carry. You'll move out in an hour, well before the rest of us. You'll find a concealed position at the top of that ridge, string your wire, and you will watch. You will be my guardian angel. You will report on any enemy movement you see. Do you understand the importance of this task?" "Yes, Sergeant," he said, standing up a little straighter. "I do. I won't let you down." "You already did, I thought. See that you don't." I turned back to the others. "That's it. Get the men ready. Full combat load. We move at 0500. I dismissed them, but kept my eyes on Pennington. He stood there for a moment, then turned and practically ran to his gear, a new, desperate energy in his movements. He was a dead man who had just been granted a pardon, and he didn't even realize he was just being moved to a different cell on death row. The hour before his departure was a study in isolation. As he began to assemble his gear, the other men gave him a wide berth. He was no longer just an outcast. He was now on a separate, lonely path. He struggled with the heavy spool of copper communication wire, trying to rig it to his pack. It was a heavy, awkward load, designed for a two-man team. He would be carrying it alone. No one offered to help. They just watched him, their faces impassive. He was already gone, a ghost departing before his time. He laid out his equipment with painstaking care. The bulky, hand-cranked field phone, the extra bandoliers of ammunition, the C-ration cans, the 2 heavy canteens. He moved with a feverish intensity, his hands, which I had once noted for their softness, now clumsy and scarred. He was checking and rechecking every buckle and strap, his fear manifesting as a desperate need for order and control. I watched him, feeling nothing. No pity, no remorse. This was a tactical decision. I was removing a faulty part from a complex machine before it caused a catastrophic failure. This was war. The sentiment was for the letters home to the grieving mothers. Here, on the ground, there was only cold, hard arithmetic. When he was finally ready, he looked like a walking junk pile. The pack towered over his head, the spool of wire throwing him off balance. The heavy phone banged against his hip. He looked small and frail under the immense weight of his solitary mission. He stood before me, his face pale but resolute, his fear hidden behind a thin veneer of determination. I did a final inspection, not out of concern, but out of protocol. I tugged on his straps, checked his ammunition, made sure his canteens were full. "You know how to use this thing?" I asked, tapping the field phone. "Yes, Sergeant. We trained on it in basic." "Good. But let's be clear about when you use it." I leaned in close, my voice a low growl that was for him alone. You are up there to be seen and not heard. You do not engage the enemy. You do not fire your rifle unless they are standing on top of you. You are a pair of eyes, nothing more. The wire is your only voice. And you use that voice only if you see something that is going to wipe us out. I'm not talking about a couple of soldiers on a trail. I'm talking about machine gun nests we can't see. I'm talking about a mortar platoon setting up. I'm talking about a tank. Don't you dare call me to tell me about a goddamn bullfrog. Do you understand me? I understand, Sergeant, he whispered, his throat dry. And another thing, I added, my eyes cold. That wire is your lifeline. You guard it. If it gets cut, you are alone. No one is coming to look for you. No one is coming to help you. Your mission is to watch that valley. You stay there until we relieve you or you run out of food. You are completely on your own. The reality of his isolation finally seemed to land on him. The flicker of hope in his eyes died, replaced by a deep, primal fear. He was being cast out, sent into the wilderness alone. He was being sacrificed. He finally saw it. He simply nodded, unable to speak. Go, I said, turning my back on him. Get moving. You need to be on that ridge before dawn. He hesitated for a second, then turned and began to walk, his steps heavy and uncertain under the load. He moved toward the dense, black wall of the jungle that marked the edge of our perimeter. He didn't look back. He just pushed a broad-leafed fern aside and was swallowed by the darkness. He was gone. A heavy silence fell over the squad. The men watched the spot where he had disappeared, then looked at me. I met their gazes, my face a mask of iron. Brooklyn was the first to speak, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. That ridge is a long way off, Sarge. And he ain't exactly a woodsman. He has a map and a compass, I said flatly. And he has his orders. I turned to face them, the remaining men of my platoon. My men. The ones I had to keep alive. All right. Forget him. He's got his job. We've got ours. Now for the real plan. Their attention snapped to me, their expressions shifting from doubt to focus. Harris wants us to walk his pretty little line on the map. We're not going to do that. We'll start down that trail, make enough noise for any listeners to track us. But half a mile in, there's a fork the map doesn't show. An old logging track. It's overgrown, but it'll take us west, up into the hills. We're going to swing wide around this whole damn valley. We're going to hit that depot from the high ground, from the rear. We're going in quiet, and we're going in hard. And we are going to assume it's a trap until we see the last Jap dead at our feet. A wave of relief and renewed purpose washed over them. This was a plan that made sense. This was a plan for survival. They began to move, checking their weapons, preparing their gear with the quiet efficiency of professionals. The ghost of Pennington was already fading from their minds. As I began my own preparations, I let myself think about him for a final moment. I pictured him out there, alone in the suffocating darkness, fighting his way up that ridge with his heavy, useless load. I wasn't a monster. I didn't want the kid to die. In a strange, twisted way, I was probably giving him a better chance of survival than if he had stayed with us. The ridge was most likely deserted. He would sit there, scared out of his wits, for a day or two, and eventually, the mission would be over. He might get lost. He might run into a stray patrol. But his chances, alone on that hill, were probably better than his chances with us in the valley, where his fear could get him and everyone around him killed. I was protecting my men. I was doing my job. It was a brutal calculus, but it was the only math that mattered. I was sacrificing one piece to save the rest of the board. War was not for boys who wore gold watches and complained about the dirt. It was a filthy, savage business for men who were willing to make filthy, savage decisions. And I had just made mine. I put Charles Pennington Jr. out of my mind. He was no longer my problem. He was a risk that had been neutralized. The world was a mess of gray and black, the jungle not yet willing to admit the sun existed. A clammy, pre-dawn chill clung to the air, a brief respite from the oppressive heat that would soon descend. There was no bugle, no whistle, just a series of quiet nudges and hissed whispers passed down the line. We moved like ghosts, detaching ourselves from the miserable ridge that had been our home and melting into the trail. Every man was a professional. The fear was there. It was always there, a cold co-pilot in your gut, but it was caged, locked behind years of training and the hard-won discipline of survival. They trusted my plan. I could see it in the way they moved, the quiet confidence in their posture. We were not walking into the valley. We were hunters circling our prey. I let them make a bit of noise for the first half-mile. A clank of a canteen here, a loud, squelching step in the mud there. Sounds that were careless, but not too careless. Just enough to let any listening post know that the stupid Americans were coming, right down the trail, just as expected. My senses were on fire, every nerve ending tingling. I was tasting the air, listening to the jungle's rhythm, searching for a single note out of key. The jungle was quiet. Too quiet. The normal morning chatter of birds and insects was subdued, a sign that other predators were nearby. We reached the overgrown logging track, a barely visible scar on the side of the trail, hidden by a curtain of thick vines. I gave a hand signal, a silent flick of my wrist, and the point man slipped into the foliage. One by one, the rest of the platoon followed, the jungle swallowing us whole. The change was immediate. The relatively open trail was gone, replaced by a claustrophobic tunnel of green. We had to use machetes to clear the way, the thick, wet leaves slapping against our faces, drenching us in dew and rainwater. The going was slow, exhausting work. Every foot was earned. The air grew thick and stagnant, alive with the drone of mosquitoes and the smell of rot. This was the hard part, the part that separated the soldiers from the boys. It was a grueling, miserable slog, and my men did it without a word of complaint. They were focused. This was the smart move. This was the plan that kept you alive. As we climbed higher, moving parallel to the main valley, I allowed myself a sliver of professional pride. We had vanished. Any Japanese patrol watching that main trail would see nothing, hear nothing. They would assume we were delayed, or perhaps they'd grow complacent. We were a snake, sliding silently through the undergrowth to strike from an unexpected direction. After 3 hours of torturous hiking, we reached the crest of the western ridge. Below us, through a break in the trees, lay the Karigura Valley, and in its center, the supply depot. It looked exactly as the recon photos had shown, a collection of long, low storehouses and makeshift barracks clustered around a muddy clearing. It was silent. Still, no smoke rose from any cook fires. No trucks moved in the yard. No guards patrolled the perimeter. It was a ghost town. Looks like the lieutenant was right for once, Sarge, Brooklyn whispered, crawling up beside me. Place is dead as a doornail. Maybe, I grunted, raising my binoculars. I scanned the depot, building by building, window by window. I searched the tree line, the shadows, the dark spaces under the buildings. Nothing. It felt wrong. My gut, an organ I had learned to trust more than any intelligence report, was screaming at me. This was too easy. It was a table set for a feast, with no sign of the host. All right, I said, lowering the glasses. The plan is the same. We go in quiet. First and second squads will clear the northern buildings. Third squad, you're with me, we'll take the command hut in the center. We move fast, and we check every dark corner. Assume every shadow holds a Jap until you prove otherwise. No grenades unless you have to. We don't want to bring the whole damn Imperial Army down on us if we can help it. The men nodded, their faces grim. We began the descent, moving down the steep, slippery slope with practiced ease. We were shadows, flowing between the trees. We crossed the final 100 yards of open ground at a low crouch, our weapons up, our hearts pounding a rhythm against our ribs that was louder than our footsteps. We reached the first building, a long, wooden warehouse. Deacon and his squad stacked up on the door, then flowed inside, their movements economical and deadly. A moment later, Deacon appeared at the doorway and gave me the all-clear sign. One building after another, the result was the same. Empty. We found crates of ammunition, sacks of rice, discarded equipment, but no soldiers. The place had been abandoned, and recently. There were still half-eaten bowls of fish and rice on some of the tables, chopsticks resting beside them. It was as if the enemy had simply vanished into thin air. The false sense of security began to creep in, a dangerous, seductive warmth. The tension in the men's shoulders began to ease. Maybe, just this once, the brass had been right. We reached the center of the depot. The command hut stood before us, a slightly larger building with a radio antenna, now broken and dangling, on its roof. This is it, I whispered to my squad. Let's clear this last one and call it a day. We moved toward the hut, our boots crunching on the gravelly mud. We were 20 feet away, 10 feet. My hand was reaching for the flimsy wooden door. I was already thinking about the report I would have to write, the bitter taste of being wrong. And then the world exploded. It wasn't one gun. It was everything. A sound so loud, so all-consuming, that it felt like the sky was being torn in half. From the windows of the very buildings we had just cleared, from camouflaged spider holes in the ground we had just walked over, from hidden bunkers in the tree line we had just descended from, a storm of machine gun fire erupted. It wasn't an ambush. It was an annihilation. We hadn't snuck up on a ghost town. We had walked calmly into the center of a perfectly designed killing box. The sound of the Japanese Type 92 woodpecker heavy machine gun is a sound you never forget. It's not the terrifying, high-speed rip of a German MG-42. It's a slower, more deliberate thump-thump-thump, a methodical, stuttering jackhammer that seems to count out each life it takes. And there were at least 4 of them, their fire converging on the center of the clearing, turning the air into a solid wall of lead. Men screamed. Men died. The first volley was devastating. I saw Sanchez get thrown backwards, his chest a red ruin. I saw 2 men from Deacon's squad cut down as they tried to run for cover. There was no thought, only instinct. I screamed, "Cover!" and dove headfirst behind a pile of rotting sandbags, the dirt around me erupting in a spray of deadly hornets. The world devolved into a chaotic, terrifying blur of noise and violence. Muzzle flashes winked from a dozen impossible places. The Japanese had let us walk all the way in. They had watched us clear their empty buildings, waited until my entire platoon was exposed in the center of the depot, and then they had sprung their trap from all sides. My smart plan, my brilliant flanking maneuver, had accomplished nothing. It had just delivered us to the slaughterhouse by the back door. Our support, a light M5 Stuart tank we'd nicknamed the Brawler, had been lumbering behind us. Its turret began to traverse, its .30 caliber machine gun chattering, trying to find a target. Its 37mm cannon fired with a sharp crack, blowing a hole in the side of one of the warehouses. For a brief, glorious second, I thought it might save us. It was a symbol of American steel, a monster that could crush their flimsy positions. Then I saw the flash of movement. A Japanese soldier, his face contorted in a fanatic scream, erupted from a hole in the ground not 10 feet from the tank. He was holding a long pole with a cone-shaped charge on the end, a lunge mine. He ran with a suicidal desperation, ignoring the stream of bullets from the coaxial gun that stitched across his chest. He took 5, 6, 7 hits, but his momentum carried him forward. In his last living second, he slammed the mine against the tank side, just above the treads. The explosion was a deafening crump. It blew the soldier into a red mist and tore the tank's track clean off. The Stuart lurched to a halt, crippled, one side sagging. Before the crew could even react, the sharp, distinctive crack of a 47mm anti-tank gun echoed from the tree line. The shell hit the turret with a clang of tortured metal, and the tank, our beautiful, powerful steel monster, went silent. The hatch flew open and the commander tried to bail out, only to be cut in half by a burst from a woodpecker. We were alone. We were trapped. Radio. I screamed over the din, "Get me the radio." I saw our radio operator, a young private named Cohen, crawling towards me, dragging his heavy SCR 300. He was halfway across the open ground when a burst of machine gun fire caught him in the back. He arched, a silent scream on his lips, and fell forward, his dead weight crashing down on top of the radio, shattering the delicate vacuum tubes, and casing into a useless heap of plastic and wire. The last thread connecting us to the outside world was severed. No one knew where we were. No one knew we were in trouble. No one was coming. We were trapped rats in a barrel, and the Japanese were taking their time, enjoying the shoot. We found what little cover we could, behind crates, in shell holes, inside the bullet-riddled buildings they'd let us occupy. The initial shock gave way to the grim, desperate business of fighting for your life. Deacon was in a warehouse opposite me, his bar hammering away, providing what little covering fire he could. Brooklyn was behind the same sandbags as me, firing his M1 with a cold, methodical fury. "Doc," I yelled, my throat raw. "Doc, we need you." Doc Russo was already moving, a low, crab-like crawl from one wounded man to another. He was a hero, a man of impossible courage, but he was not a magician. The casualties were overwhelming. I saw him reach a man whose leg was a bloody pulp. Doc slapped a tourniquet on, injected a syringe of morphine, but his movements were frantic. He crawled over to me a few minutes later, his face pale, his hands covered in blood. "Sarge, it's bad," he gasped, his voice trembling. "I'm out of plasma. I'm almost out of bandages. I'm patching guys up with scraps from their own damn shirts. If we don't get out of here, the wounded are all gonna die, even the ones who aren't hit bad." The Japanese mortars started up, the shells from their dreaded Type 89 mortars arcing high into the air and falling almost silently amongst us. They exploded with a sharp crump crump crump, sending shards of hot metal in every direction. Then came the grenades. We'd hear the faint clink of the fuse being struck, followed by the arcing flight of a Type 97, and then scramble to get away from the blast. I looked at my men, my veterans. These were the hardest men I knew, soldiers who had survived hells I couldn't even describe. And I saw fear in their eyes. Not the wild panic of a greenhorn like Pennington, but a deeper, more terrible fear. The cold, certain knowledge of a hopeless situation. They knew what this was. This was the end of the line. We had to try something. We couldn't just sit here and be picked apart. The main machine gun nest, the one that had started it all, was chewing us to pieces. It was in the command hut, the very building we had been about to enter. It was our only way out. "Brooklyn, Deacon," I yelled into the maelstrom. "Covering fire. We're going to try and flank that hut. Free volunteers. On me." It was a suicide mission, and we all knew it. But 3 men, without hesitation, began to crawl towards me. We waited for a lull, for Deacon's bar to suppress the gunners. "Now," I screamed, and we broke cover, running low and fast, trying to use the wrecked tank as a stepping stone to get to the hut's blind side. It was a futile gesture. The Japanese were not amateurs. They had anticipated this exact move. A second machine gun, one we hadn't even known existed, opened up from a flank, its fire perfectly positioned to cover the approach to the hut. 2 of my volunteers went down instantly, their bodies twitching in the mud. I was thrown to the ground by the sheer force of the bullets impacting the dirt next to me. We were forced to crawl back, dragging the 1 wounded man we could reach, leaving 2 more bodies to rot in the clearing. The trap was not just good, it was perfect. Every angle was covered. Every escape route was a killing field. As I lay behind the sandbags, the taste of cordite and my own blood in my mouth, the full weight of my failure crashed down on me. My plan, my smart move. I had been so arrogant, so sure that I could outthink the enemy. I had scoffed at the lieutenant's orders, at the official intelligence. I had trusted my gut, my experience. And my experience had led my men into the grave. I had marched them right into the center of this meat grinder, and now they were paying for my pride with their lives. I looked at the carnage around me. The burning tank, the shattered radio, the still, khaki-clad forms lying in the mud, their lifeblood mixing with the rain. I thought of Miller, the kid from Ohio. I had been so angry at Pennington for his part in that death. But what was this? This was a massacre of my own making. I had killed these men as surely as if I had pulled the trigger myself. The sun began to set, painting the clouds a sickening shade of orange and purple. The firing died down to a sporadic, harassing sniper shot now and then. The Japanese knew they had us. They could wait. They could finish us off in the morning. We consolidated our position, dragging the wounded into a slightly more sheltered building. I did a head count. Of the 32 men who had followed me into this valley, 12 were still effective. 8 were dead. The rest were wounded, some grievously. We were surrounded, cut off, with no radio, no hope of rescue, and with ammunition and medical supplies dwindling to almost nothing. We were going to die here, in this muddy, forgotten corner of a godforsaken island. I leaned my head back against the bullet-pocked wall, the cold reality settling in. It was over. All my years, all my battles, all my survival had led me to this, to lead the last of my men to their deaths. In that moment of utter, black despair, as I stared into the coming darkness, the thought of the rich kid I had sent off on a fool's errand, the boy named Charles Pennington Jr., never even crossed my mind. He had been completely and utterly forgotten, a trivial detail from a lifetime ago. Night in a combat zone is not a time of rest. It is merely a different kind of war, a war fought against the shadows in your own mind. The darkness in that shattered depot was a living thing, thick and absolute, broken only by the faint, ghostly luminescence of jungle rot on a decaying log. The physical battle had paused, but the psychological siege was relentless. Every rustle of leaves was a soldier crawling through the wire, every snap of a twig a prelude to a bayonet in the gut. But our greatest enemy was the sound coming from our own position, the low, steady groans of the wounded. It was a sound that hollowed you out from the inside. Each moan was a testament to Doc Russo's dwindling supplies and my own catastrophic failure. I sat with my back against a bullet-riddled wall, my Thompson heavy across my lap, and listened to the litany of suffering. I did the grim arithmetic of survival. 8 men were dead. 14 were wounded, at least 6 of them so badly they would not survive the night. That left me with 10 effective fighting men, including myself. 10 men with maybe half a dozen clips each, a handful of grenades, and no hope. I didn't sleep. Sleep was a betrayal. I moved through our makeshift aid station, a corner of a warehouse that smelled of blood and mud and fear. Doc Russo was sitting on an ammo crate, his head in his hands, his body trembling with an exhaustion so profound it was like a physical illness. He had done all he could. Now he was just a witness to the slow, inevitable dying. I saw Brooklyn, the loudmouth from the city, silently rebandaging the arm of a younger kid, his movements gentle, his face a grim, unfamiliar mask of compassion. I saw Deacon, kneeling beside a boy whose breath was coming in shallow, wet rasps, his hand on the boy's forehead, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He was not praying for a miracle. He was helping a soul find its way in the dark. My own soul was a cold, dead cinder. The anger I had felt at myself had burned out, leaving only a vast, empty landscape of resignation. I had accepted our fate. We would die here. My only remaining duty was to choreograph the final act. We would not be slaughtered in a rout. We would die on our feet, behind our rifles. We would make the Japanese pay a butcher's bill for this small, insignificant piece of mud. I spent the hours before dawn positioning my remaining men, creating fields of fire, designating who would use the last of the grenades. It was a cold, methodical process, the last tactical problem of my life. I felt no fear, no sadness. I felt nothing at all. I was already a ghost. As the first hint of gray began to dilute the blackness of the sky, a change came over the jungle. The rain stopped. The oppressive hiss that had been the soundtrack to our misery for days faded, leaving an unnerving silence. A thick, wet mist rose from the ground, shrouding the depot in a soft, white blanket. It was ethereal, almost beautiful, and it felt like a mockery. The world was putting on a pretty dress for our funeral. Through the mist, I saw movement from the Japanese lines. They were stirring, their shadowy forms emerging from their holes. They were forming up. This was it. The final assault. They would come in a wave, screaming banzai, and it would all be over in a storm of fire and steel. I raised my binoculars, my hands steady. A Japanese officer, sword at his hip, was directing the men, his arm pointing directly at our position. I watched him, this man who was about to kill us, and I felt a strange sense of connection, a shared purpose. We were 2 professionals at the end of a long, hard day's work. Then I heard it. It was a single, sharp sound that was utterly alien to the symphony of Japanese weapons we had grown accustomed to. It was a loud, commanding crack that was as American as baseball and apple pie. It was the unmistakable report of an M1 Garand. The sound came from an impossible direction. Not from the rear, where a relief force would be. Not from the flanks. It came from the east. From the top of Ridge 212, the remote, jungle-choked monster of a hill on the far side of the valley. For a split second, my brain refused to process the information. It was a trick of the acoustics, an echo from some distant, unrelated battle. The Japanese officer, the one I had been watching, stiffened. He lurched forward, as if pushed by an invisible hand. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, a comical expression of surprise on his face, before his legs gave out and he crumpled to the ground. Stunned silence. The Japanese soldiers froze, looking at their fallen officer, then turning their heads in confusion, trying to pinpoint the source of the shot. My own men were just as baffled. We stared at each other, our eyes wide with a question that had no answer. Then, a second sound drifted across the misty valley, faint but clear. A sharp, metallic ping. The sound of an M1's and block clip being ejected after the 8th round had been fired. It was real. It wasn't an echo. Someone was up on that ridge. Someone with an American rifle. And he was a dead shot. Who the hell is that? Brooklyn hissed, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Shut up. I snapped, my mind racing, trying to solve the impossible equation. A relief force wouldn't send a single rifleman. Another lost patrol? Maybe. It had to be. Some other poor bastards, as lost as we were, had stumbled onto a perch overlooking the battle. It was a one-in-a-million miracle. A lucky break. It wouldn't change the outcome, but it was something. The Japanese, recovering from the initial shock, were furious. The death of an officer was a grave insult. They were a hive that had been kicked. Their discipline reasserted itself, but now it was fueled by a vengeful rage. A new officer began shouting orders, his voice shrill and angry. He pointed at the command hut, at the heavy machine gun nest that had chewed us to pieces the day before. The woodpecker began its slow, deliberate thump-thump-thump again, spraying our position with suppressive fire, pinning us down for the charge that was surely coming. The men in my position hunched down, their faces grim. The miracle was over. The reality of our situation returned with the force of a physical blow. The woodpecker was the anchor of their position, the linchpin of their trap. As long as it was firing, we couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then the impossible happened again. From that same spot on the misty ridge, a small, dark object sailed through the air in a high, graceful arc. It looked like a bird, a thrown stone, impossibly far, impossibly accurate. It tumbled end over end, growing larger, and then dropped from view, right through the black, rectangular window of the command hut where the machine gun was nested. There was a muffled hump. A puff of smoke and splintered wood erupted from the window, and the woodpecker went silent. The silence that followed was more profound, more shocking, than the explosion itself. The linchpin was gone. The anchor was broken. We stared at the silent hut, then at the ridge across the valley, our minds struggling to comprehend what we had just witnessed. To make that throw, with a standard hand grenade, from that distance, it wasn't possible. It was a feat of almost superhuman strength and accuracy. The Japanese were no longer confused. They were terrified. They had been masters of this valley, untouchable gods in their perfectly laid trap. Now, they were being picked apart by an unseen, phantom enemy. They started screaming, a chorus of panicked, angry shouts. They forgot about us. Their immediate, tangible enemy was forgotten. They turned their attention, their rifles, their machine guns, to the ghost on the ridge. The jungle on the eastern slope erupted as hundreds of Japanese soldiers fired wildly into the trees, a panicked, undisciplined fusillade of rage and fear. They were shooting at a ghost, wasting their ammunition on a target they couldn't see. And in that moment, my brain, which had been paralyzed by shock, re-engaged. The cold, tactical part of my mind took over. This wasn't a miracle. It was an opportunity so slim, so improbable, that it felt like a dream. But it was real. Now, I roared, my voice shocking the men out of their stupor. He's drawing their fire. Move. Get the wounded. Back to the warehouse. Go, go, go. Survival instinct is a powerful thing. My men surged into motion. We grabbed the wounded, slinging them over our shoulders, dragging them through the mud. It was a desperate, chaotic scramble. We moved from the exposed building where we had spent the night to the larger, more defensible warehouse next to the now silent command hut. The Japanese, completely consumed by the threat from their rear, barely fired a shot in our direction. We consolidated our position, dragging crates and sacks of rice to form new barricades, all while the sound of a one-sided battle raged across the valley. Just as we got the last of the wounded inside, the ghost gave us another gift. A Japanese supply truck, parked near the tree line and loaded with what I assumed was ammunition and mortar rounds, suddenly exploded. A massive, rolling fireball of orange and black climbed into the morning sky, followed by a concussive boom that shook the ground. Secondary explosions began to pop and crackle as the ammunition cooked off. The ghost hadn't just thrown a grenade. He had hit a fuel tank or an ammo crate with another impossible rifle shot from 800 yards away. The mortar fire that had been harassing us ceased immediately. The truck had likely been their main supply of shells. The ghost wasn't just killing them. He was systematically dismantling their ability to fight. He was thinking. He was a tactician. The firing from the Japanese lines began to sputter and die down. Their initial panic was being replaced by a cautious, fearful silence. They were hunkering down, trying to deal with this invisible demon that had descended upon them. The immediate threat to us had vanished, replaced by an eerie, watchful quiet. We stood behind our new barricades, breathing heavily, and stared across the valley at the ridge. The mist was beginning to burn off, but the jungle canopy was still thick and impenetrable. There was no sign of movement, just the silent, green mountain that held our savior. Brooklyn leaned against a crate next to me, wiping sweat and mud from his face with a trembling hand. He stared at the ridge, his eyes full of a kind of religious awe. "Sarge," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "What the hell is that?" I lowered my binoculars, my heart hammering in my chest. For the first time since we had walked into this valley, I felt a flicker of something I had thought was long dead. Hope. It was a fragile, dangerous feeling, but it was there. I had no idea who was on that ridge. I had no idea how he had gotten there, or why he was helping us. The thought of Pennington flickered at the very back of my mind, a thought so absurd, so completely illogical, that I crushed it instantly. It was impossible. The kid who froze at the sound of a single rifle shot could not be this phantom of vengeance. It had to be someone else. It didn't matter who it was. "I don't know who it is, Brooklyn," I said, my voice low and steady, feeling the eyes of my remaining men on me. "But he's on our side, and he just bought us a chance." I looked at their faces. The despair was gone, replaced by a wild, desperate hope. They were looking at me, waiting for the next order, ready to follow me again. The ghost on the ridge hadn't just saved our lives. He had given me back my platoon. I felt a new, hard resolve solidify within me. We were not going to die here. We were going to fight. We were going to win. "All right, listen up," I said, my voice ringing with a confidence I didn't truly feel but had to project. "Check your ammo. Get the wounded comfortable. Our friend across the way has given us a breather. The Japs are spooked. They don't know what to do, but they will. And when they make their next move, we make ours." I looked from man to man, my gaze locking with theirs. "Our ghost is not going to get us out of here. He's just opened the door. We have to walk through it ourselves. Get ready. When he makes his next move, we move too. We're getting out of this hell." The hope that our phantom savior had given us was a fragile, desperate thing, a single candle flame in a hurricane. We were still trapped, still outnumbered, and the Japanese were not going to simply surrender the field. The initial shock of the ghost's attack had worn off, replaced by a cold, methodical fury. They were hunters, and their wounded prey had suddenly grown teeth. Now, they would become exterminators. We watched from our new position in the warehouse as the Japanese reorganized. They were no longer focused on us. Their attention was fixed on the green, silent monster of Ridge 212. I saw an officer, the replacement for the one who had been shot, gesturing emphatically, sending a full platoon, at least 30 men, scrambling into the jungle, beginning the long, slow climb up the eastern slope. They were going to hunt the ghost. A sickening feeling of helplessness washed over me. We were listening to the death sentence of our savior being carried out, and we could do nothing but watch. The firefight started 10 minutes later. It wasn't the sustained roar of a major engagement. It was the lonely, defiant crack of a single M1 Garand, answered by the angry chatter of a dozen Arisaka rifles and the occasional burst from a Nambu light machine gun. Our ghost was smart. We could tell by the sound. He wasn't staying in one place. The crack of his Garand would come from one spot, followed by a furious volley of Japanese fire into the now empty position. Then, a minute later, his rifle would speak again from 100 yards to the left. He was moving. He was using the jungle, turning their greatest ally against them. He was fighting a battle of one, a lonely war of survival on that ridge, and he was doing it for us. "He can't keep that up for long, Sarge," Deacon muttered, his voice tight with tension. "They'll corner him." He was right. 30-1 are impossible odds, even for a ghost. We watched and listened, our own battle forgotten, our fate now completely tied to the lone American fighting on that hill. The sounds of the fight grew more intense, closer together. The Japanese were closing their net. For 10 agonizing minutes, the ridge was alive with gunfire. Then, silence. A deep, profound silence that felt heavier and more final than the noise it replaced. The Japanese patrol had done its work. The Ghost was dead. The men around me slumped, the last of the hope draining from their faces. It had been a valiant effort, a miracle that had bought us a few more hours of life. But it was over. I looked across the clearing. The Japanese, confident that their phantom tormentor was eliminated, were turning their attention back to us. And they were bringing up their trump card. It was the 47mm anti-tank gun that had crippled our Stuart. It was a viciously effective weapon, designed to kill tanks, but more than capable of turning our warehouse, and everyone in it, into a pile of splintered wood and bloody rags. For soldiers were manhandling it, wheeling it out from behind a building, positioning it for a clear shot. It was the executioner's axe being brought to the block. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. This was the end. I gripped my Thompson, ready to sell my life dearly, but I knew it was a futile gesture. We would die in the next 30 seconds. As the gun crew rammed a shell into the breach, I saw it. A flash. It was a brilliant, blinding glint of light from the very top of Ridge 212. From a spot even higher than where the firefight had been. It wasn't a muzzle flash. It was pure, clean sunlight, captured and thrown back with purpose. It flashed once, twice, a third time. It was a signal, a desperate, silent scream for help. The Ghost was alive. He had outsmarted them. He had led the patrol into a chase on the lower slopes, then slipped away and climbed to the summit. He was alive, and he was not done fighting. Then, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, came a sound that was sweeter than any church choir I had ever heard. It was the high, buzzing drone of a single-engine airplane. Our airplane. A Stinson L-5 Sentinel, a little grasshopper observation plane, flying a high, lazy circle over the battlefield. It was a scout, a pair of eyes in the sky. The Japanese heard it too. The crew of the anti-tank gun paused, their officers shouting and pointing at the sky. They had a choice. Fire on the warehouse and finish us, or try to eliminate the spotter plane that could bring the wrath of God down upon them. They chose the plane. They began to crank the elevation wheel, tilting the long barrel of their gun towards the sky. On the ridge, the flashes became more frantic, a desperate, rhythmic pulse of light. The Ghost was guiding the pilot's eyes, screaming here. Here is the target. The little plane, bless its brave pilot, must have seen it. It dipped its wings in acknowledgement and began to bank away. The Ghost on the ridge must have realized what the Japanese were doing. The flashes of light stopped, replaced by the sharp crack of his M1 Garand. He was firing down on the gun crew, not to kill them. The range was too extreme, but to distract them, to spoil their aim, to buy the pilot a few more precious seconds. The 47mm gun fired with a deafening roar. The shell tore through the air, a black speck chasing the little plane. It exploded 100 yards behind it, a harmless puff of black smoke against the blue sky. The Grasshopper, its mission accomplished, continued its turn and disappeared over the horizon. Every man on that battlefield, American and Japanese, knew what was coming next. The pilot had our coordinates. The artillery was on its way. For the Japanese, the knowledge was a death sentence. Their perfect trap had become their tomb. Panic erupted. Discipline, which had been their greatest weapon, dissolved into a mad scramble for survival. Some tried to flee back up the trail we had descended. Others, in a final act of fanatical devotion, fixed their bayonets and charged our warehouse, screaming, preferring a soldier's death to being obliterated by unseen guns. We met their charge with a disciplined wall of fire, cutting them down in the mud. Then the world ended. The first shell was a freight train, screaming out of the sky and landing in the center of the depot with a cataclysmic crump. Then another, and another. A rolling, thundering barrage of American 105mm high-explosive shells walked across the valley, a steel broom sweeping the depot clean. The earth shook, the air crackled, and the world was nothing but the roar of explosions and the whistle of shrapnel. We huddled in our warehouse, praying that the artillerymen in the rear were as good as they were supposed to be. The barrage lasted for 5 minutes that felt like an eternity. Then, silence. A ringing, deafening silence, punctuated by the crackle of fires and the groans of the enemy wounded. The battle was over. We waited, our hearts pounding, for what felt like an hour. Then, we saw a figure, a lone man, walking not from the ridge, but stumbling down the western slope, the path we had originally taken. He was a scarecrow, a creature made of mud and blood and exhaustion. His uniform was in tatters, one arm hung limply at his side, and he leaned heavily on his rifle as if it were a crutch. As he got closer, a wave of stunned, silent disbelief washed over my men. It was Pennington. He limped into the shattered depot, his eyes vacant, staring straight ahead. He walked past the corpses of the men he had killed, past the stunned faces of the men he had saved. He walked until he was standing in front of me. Then he stopped, swaying on his feet, on the very edge of collapse. The terrified boy I had sent out into the jungle was gone forever. The eyes that looked at me were ancient, haunted by things I could only imagine. He wasn't holding his rifle like a soldier. He was holding it like a lifeline. And in his other hand, held with a strange reverence, was a mangled piece of metal. A gold-colored watch, its crystal shattered, its face scratched beyond recognition, its leather strap broken. He looked at me, and his voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "Sergeant." He held up the watch. I saw the plane. The sun, it was right there. "Boy Scouts, we learn how to signal." He took a shuddering breath, his strength failing him. I think my wire got cut. And that was it. That was his report. Brooklyn let out a choked sound that was half laugh, half sob. Deacon just stared, slowly shaking his head, a look of profound, absolute awe on his face. The whole impossible story crashed down on me. The lone figure on the ridge. The dead-eye shot that killed the officer. The impossible grenade throw. The shot that blew the truck. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a lost patrol. It was him. Private Charles Pennington, Jr. The spoiled rich kid. The burden. Shiny. He had done it all. He had survived the patrol sent to hunt him, leading them on a chase before doubling back and climbing to the summit. He had fought a battle of one, buying us time. And then, with his last ounce of strength, he had taken out that useless, expensive piece of jewelry I had mocked him for, and he had used it to touch the sky. He had used his knowledge, his intelligence, the skills from a life I had held in contempt, and he had saved us all. I looked him up and down. I saw the blood soaking his sleeve from a shrapnel wound. I saw the deep, ugly gash on his forehead. I saw the burns on his hands. I saw the 1,000-yard stare in his eyes, a look that I knew would never leave him. I saw the empty space where a boy used to be, now filled by a man forged in the crucible of a lonely, desperate war. He was a soldier. He was one of us. I didn't say a word. Words were useless, inadequate things. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I stood up straight, brought my heels together, and gave him a single, short, sharp nod. It was a gesture of command, a sign of dismissal. But it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement. It was an apology. It was the highest form of respect I was capable of giving. Later that evening, after the first relief column had reached us and the medics were taking care of the wounded, what was left of my platoon sat by a small, crackling fire. There were so many empty spaces in our circle. We were alive, but we were not whole. Pennington sat a little ways off, alone, staring into the flames, a clean bandage on his head and his arm in a sling. I walked over to him, my own canteen in my hand. It was the one I kept reserved, the one with a splash of captured Japanese whiskey in it for emergencies. I considered this an emergency. I stopped in front of him. He looked up, his eyes questioning. I didn't speak. I simply unscrewed the cap, took a short, sharp pull from the canteen, and then held it out to him. He looked at the canteen, then at my face. A flicker of understanding passed through his tired eyes. He reached out with his good hand and took it. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own, and took a long, slow drink. He was no longer Charles Pennington, Jr. He wasn't even the ghost of Ridge 212. He was just a soldier, sitting with his sergeant at the end of a long day. He had complained about the dirt, this rich kid from a world away. But in the end, when we were all trapped in the mud, he was the only one who knew how to reach for the sky.